This is the Todd Shapiro Show on Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.
Hi, Lance Lambert, BovedaInc.com. It's great to catch up with you. How are you?
Todd, I'm good. It's been a crazy week so far, but hanging in there. How about yourself?
You know, every day is a crazy day. There's not a day, just when things are kind of normal, my mind goes, Lance, okay, 5 minutes from now, crazy's coming. It's happening.
Yep.
But you know what? I'd rather that than complacency and being bored. So, you take it all in stride and perspective, and aren't we blessed?
Man, you're preaching. That is very true. Very true.
I'm a preacher, brother. I'm a preach on. Hey, you were last week in Vancouver for the LIFT Expo, and you learned some great insights about sort of the Canadian market and stuff. Where are we at? What's going on here, Lance?
Yeah, I did. I went straight on. I was out at headquarters when we last spoke in Minneapolis for a couple of days of offsite with the leadership team, and then just transitioned right into a flight over to Vancouver, and got there for one of our favorite shows north of the border, that is LIFT. They have an event, in Vancouver and Toronto every year. And so, I was looking forward to getting back out there and didn't know what to expect. We had several of our friends from Canada, including yourself, that came down for MJ Biz, which is our big industry event, technically the largest B2B show, I believe, in the world for the industry. And you were one of several friends that said, man, it's crazy hearing all the laughing and the smiles and the happy-go-lucky down here because things have been a little bit on the downside in Canada. So I wasn't quite sure what to expect. But having said that, getting there into Vancouver, coming into LIFT, of course, a couple new players, some people that I typically catch up with that weren't in attendance. But overall, I'd say there was still very much a positive energy at the show and definitely steady traffic. This is really nice to see because, depending on which website or which news story you look at from last year, we've talked about it, a bit of the bubble kind of burst and the industry normalized as of last summer, about June, and the whole industry lost a staggering $13 billion in 2019. Was, of course, a major upset for a lot of millennials. That was the core audience that was purchasing these stocks. But, we've talked about this as well. It really was just the industry almost resetting itself to more of a normalized space because some of those valuations were incredible, 60, 70x, very comparable to what, because you and I are a little bit older. We're definitely not millennials, but we both remembered and reminisced on how things were back in the dot-com days. It was very similar. Things just came back to reality, came back down. But having said that, those that have survived, that have maybe gone through mergers and acquisitions or adjusting their books, it seems like those guys are on the right track up there. And that was very nice to see because we've always been a big fan of the Canadian market.
Yeah, and listen, today, I don't know if did you watch the Canadian markets at all today?
A little bit. It's one of those days. So I got on first thing in the morning. I haven't seen them since.
Yeah, it was really interesting. There were good numbers. How do you say it? Organogram? Is that how you say the company?
Yes. Yep. Organogram. Yep.
So they had really big quarterly numbers. I think their stock might have closed off like 50 or 60% higher. Like it was a really big move for what we've been seeing. And I think, they outperformed, which makes, whether you invest in them or not, I actually don't know a ton about that company. But for the sector, it makes me optimistic and happy. And then, of course, the Auroras and the Afrias and, even the Canopies had a nice rebound. They're still sort of, half of what their market caps were, if not even less than half. This time last year, maybe I'm getting my numbers wrong, but I mean, there were movements of stocks between like 15 and 50% today, a lot in the cannabis stocks. So the sector will always kind of surprise people. But what I like about it, and especially as a believer in all of this, where it's all going, that, us talking, and a big part of what we were at the Las Vegas LIFT Expo was really about, it's still, we have these conversations, Lance, and you know it better than anyone. We're still so early on.
Yes, it is. We're in such early phases. I'm pulling it up now, seeing what the stats are from my friends over at Motley Fool. They always keep me up to date on such information. And they're sharing that Organogram specifically announced net revenue in Q1 of $25.2 million in Canadian dollars. So that is a 55% increase from prior quarter, justifying it looks like they closed at about a 40% up. So I think that's exactly it. Again, there's a lot going on. There's still a lot of stocks out there. It is going to normalize. I was reading one article where the guy said, a lot of people will be offended by my next statement. And his next statement was talking about how cannabis is a commodity. And some people are a little apprehensive about that. But then he went on to reference on some smaller, not macros like Canada, but more micro markets like Oregon, as an example. And then I started understanding where he is going, because Oregon is an extreme example of that, where, they started out, there's very limited licenses. They have a what we call a limitless license scenario. So all of a sudden, all these growers came on the scene, all these suppliers, all these retailers, and it really did force it into a commodity, to the point to where I have a good friend I grew up with up there that has one of the top 3 production brand facilities in Oregon, and he was selling wholesale at $1 a gram. So if you can imagine that, he sells top shelf. So you could literally get a pound for under $500, when the fair market value for wholesale across the country is closer to $1,100-1,200. So again, we are in this weird space, but Todd, you've said it before, it's so true. It's so early. You guys, literally, we could say, yes, the market's been legal since the early 2000s in Canada. It's been legal since the mid-90s in California. But as a whole, if we look at North America, really the movement and effort started building up around the legalization on the adult use side, not the medical side. And that's something that only occurred back in 2014. So we aren't too far into this new world and new market, to your point.
Yeah, and the new market and the new world, you have news on other parts of the world. What's going on in the UK?
Yeah, it's kind of a soft spot. It's where both sides of my family are from. So always keeping an eye on the UK, especially because they're going through a little thing called Brexit, and they've got Boris at the helm for that. So it's been awfully interesting. It's almost like a soap opera to follow. But I still prefer
with bad British accents.
Boris. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, there's another group of friends, Prohibition Partners. These guys put out phenomenal reports, and they do them typically by market. So they've done, U.S. market, the EU market, and they recently released a report on the UK market. And for those that aren't very familiar with geography, the UK isn't, of course, just England, but you have England, Wales, Scotland, and North Ireland that are included there. So it is a fairly large populace. They're saying that although medical has been slow to come on board, Todd, you and I have discussed that, they're saying 2020 is really the year. That's going to be the year for exponential growth, and they see as much as $1 billion or 1 billion pounds, US $1.3 billion, to 340,000 active patients by 2024, maybe even higher than that. So it's interesting to see what, based on, a lot of factors, again, where the government's at, where the consumer's at, where the adoption and exception rate is. A lot of markets do go up against some tabooisms and some stigmas. We know the UK to be fairly conservative. They have a few parties, just like Canada. But finally, they're kind of getting to that next level. So it was great to see that this could be the year for the UK with respect to cannabis.
I never even thought to look this up. On the London Stock Exchange, is there any cannabis companies that are publicly traded over there that would be based out of the UK? I've never even researched this at all.
The only company which I believe they are publicly traded is GW Pharmaceuticals, which I think we've talked about before. So they're under GWPRF. That is the one kind of company that seems to get carte blanche. I don't know if it's loaded handshakes or something. I'm not making any assumptions, but they're the ones who I've mentioned before. They're the only company out of a half dozen that have cannabinoid-based pharmaceutical products on the U.S. market. They're the only one that uses true biomass. All the rest use what we call synthetic cannabinoids. So obviously there's some sort of shoe in there. They also were the ones that lucked out and got the contract, or approval, I should say, rather, with the government out there in England to be able to supply all medical cannabis. So they are publicly traded. They have been doing well. I kind of have my opinion of them just because of these interesting advantages and such they have. It's kind of big player corporate mentality, but they're killing it. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. So that's the one that I would keep an eye on because it's one of the only ones that's actually based out of that market.
And I believe there's some IP and orphan status drugs that they have too. So one of the big movers sort of in kind of proving out how cannabis can actually eventually make true health claims, which is very rare. And those are one of the companies, right? I'm also sort of just looking, there's a couple of companies from Israel that are on the London Stock Exchange involved in cannabis. So there are some. So if you're listening for some reason out that way and you like the stock market, go and look, do your due diligence. I can never give you financial advice. I'm not working with any of these companies I'm talking about anyway. But anyway, that's really neat. And then Lance Lambert from BovedaInc.com, as we move on now from the UK. Very sadly, we're watching, I actually don't think there's enough news about it, actually, what's going on in Australia, even to the fact where, we're watching this Australian Open go on and people are having coughing attacks and can't even finish their matches. It is a really, truly dire, tragic situation, one that I hope is getting controlled. I don't even really know where they're at with containing the fires that, quite frankly, have burnt down and much of that country and taken so much of the animal population, over 1 billion animals. It's so sad. But yet they're getting into the cannabis laws, and there's some, there's still business and a country to run. And I guess, as you say, there's some present confusion and controversy around their laws.
Yeah, unfortunately. So Australia is very interesting. Another Commonwealth country, as you know, have similarities with Canada. And something that really threw us for a loop in a good way was all of a sudden the Australians' capital, ATC, their capital territory, just several months ago decided, hey, we're going to legalize personal possession and grow. And this is something that surprisingly, overall Australia, I think, was accepting, but they got a little bit of backlash from some organizations out in Europe. Saying, I don't know if it was UNODC, but it was one of the organizations pushing back a little bit. But the one thing that is kind of tough with this is, okay, it only applies to the Australian Capital Territory, but the provisions to establish and approve the marijuana supply chain is what's tough, because they are really restricted. Any growing or production that's going on, and to many surprise, there's actually several LPs out of Canada that have connections to Australia that have had, as we say, plants on the ground and plants in the ground for well over a year now. But that production, ironically, is not happening in the ACT. So you've got this capital. Canberra is actually the city capital within that territory. And now they're trying to figure out what to do, because the law is going into effect January 31st. So we've only got a few weeks. And what it says is adults in the ACT will be permitted to possess up to 50 grams of dried cannabis, which is great, or 150 grams of fresh cannabis. And using it is permitted within private homes, no public spaces, and not in the presence of children. Another thing that they did was home cultivation. So you can have up to 2 cannabis plants per adult or 4 per household, which honestly, with most genetics these days and growing options, that's more than enough to supply an individual or several individuals under one roof. But again, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. And it's kind of a flashback to Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. here in the U.S., it started out on the privatized side before it segued to the commercialized side. So you had individuals that say, you were a grower, I couldn't purchase it from you. You could gift it to me, but I could also subsequently purchase a $50 T-shirt at the same time that I received that cannabis from you. So I think that's what we're going to see, is some loopholes and workarounds in order to create some sort of environment. You can't really call it retail, but some sort of environment that allows the people to actually have access to the product, because we all know that most people don't have a green thumb, no matter what country or continent you're on. So it'll be interesting to see what comes of that over the next several months. And I'll actually be down there for they have a HHI, which is Hemp Health and Innovation Convention. They actually moved this year's to ACT. It's going to be in Canberra in April. So I'm curious to see firsthand, especially in the month of 420, what things are like down there this year.
Great to hear. And do you have any counterparts or working relationships with those in Australia right now in the cannabis industry?
Yeah, there's definitely a few. We are very close with a gentleman. They're one of our distributors called Stealth Gardens down in the Southern Territory. Also work with Whitebush up in Queensland. So we have a few on the distributor side, There's a few individuals that I work with that are more so tied to the science and education side of it. I've always had a soft spot for Australia. I think I told you the story about 3 or 4 years back, Todd, the first time I went there. I've gone almost every year since of an epic road trip I did. I actually wrote a story about it because it is such a fascinating country. There's such passionate people. And you touched on it, but it is a true travesty to see first the fires, now the floods. I can relate. Obviously, it's a much smaller scale that those natural disasters occur here in Southern California, but we have the same thing happen. We'll get devastated with a fire, and then sure enough, the rain comes in, not at the right time. It comes in after the fires go out, and then the floods come shortly after. We just had one a few years ago that 14 people passed away from the flood. So for that to happen countrywide, albeit mostly the southern portions of that country, it's in, Australia's in all of our hearts, and we really hope that they make it through and pull through on the other side.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I have a few, relationships over there. And obviously I've reached out and, sent on our behalf to everybody. We hope that everyone's doing well. And I'm actually hoping to get more information on links and things on how we can help, anything I can share over there to help, with those fighting the fires or the animal populations and stuff. My goodness, it's really sad. Lance, I really enjoy these updates. Lance and I also work together sort of away from this stuff and doing different things in a similar but different industry that we'll have more announcements on in the future. And your knowledge is so vast, your connections run so deep, and I imagine you have friends. Is there anywhere? I guess what I want to get at, being with all your world travels, Lance Lambert, is there any country you don't have friends in?
That is a great question. Not really. And there's an old producer of mine that I worked with about 10 years ago. And Todd, once you've been in the space that we've been in, you kind of stay connected. But that came up in conversation. I was like, won't it be fun to do a series or some sort of documentary? Because literally every country I fly into, there's from South Africa to South America to Australia, Asia, all across North America and Europe. I'm so fortunate to have the network I do. I land and there's that awesome individual there to greet me and take me under their wing and show me what's going on, if it's a legal market, if it's an illicit market, because I don't segregate. Matter of fact, this is something I got, Todd, out of my visit last week to Vancouver. They are calling it the legacy market. So the legacy market is the pre-legalization market. I've also heard the term the free market. It's kind of crazy, but in this PC day and age, I think it makes sense to do away with this whole black market. I'm not a fan of it. I'm not saying there's any racist undertones or anything. It's kind of a negative connotation towards people that were really just it's a plant. You and I have talked about this, right? But it's just a plant. Other things we're working with, they're natural as well. But this is just a plant, and to make it illicit and to make it something that puts so many people behind bars and ruins so many people's lives, I agree the last thing it should be called is that. So legacy market in Canada or free market in California, again, no segregation. All these people are really trying to do what's right and help others. And that's what really motivates me at the end of the day to be a part of it, to be honest.
Interesting. Listen, I'll have to think about that one because I still think of the organized crime involved and stuff. So, there are some people capitalizing on as well. But I think for those advocates that you speak of, definitely I can accept a legacy market. Lance Lambert, BovedaInc.com, Boveda, two-way humidity control packs, keeping your cannabis flower fresh. An amazing team over there. And we always love these updates. I can't wait to catch up with you next week, my friend.
Yes, definitely so. Have a good rest of the week, Todd. We will talk to you then.
Much appreciated, Lance, again, joining us.
This is the Todd Shapiro Show on Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.